the Fujifilm 8 to 16mm lens. This is a specialist lens, a very particular lens, and yeah, they really have pulled out all the stops to make an incredible lens. Well done, Fuji. All right, I must say that I was given this lens for about a week, and admittedly I only took it out this morning at about 6 o'clock to Muizenberg Beach in Cape Town just to test it out. So I do apologize, I haven't had more time to, or at least in work, to put it through its paces. But I had a good look at it this morning, and I'm very impressed with what I've seen. For me, the most interesting aspect of this lens is the fact that it's a 2.8 throughout the zoom. So, I mean, if I looked at all the other competitors sort of in this market, whether it be 35mm sensors, full frame sensors, or APS-C, they're all roughly 11 to 24, 12 to 24 focal lengths, sitting at about an f4 aperture. So being a 2.8, it is unusual. It's, I'm sure, quite an engineering feat, and I think that leads to why it is quite a big, heavy lens. You can just imagine on a full frame sensor how much bigger this lens would be if it was a 2.8 as well. Obviously, the fact that Fujifilm make great solid lenses with you know, a lot of metal components also comes into the fact that even though it may match some of the other lenses in size, it's a little bit heavier. It sits at about 800 grams. Full frame lenses with a similar sort of focal length at f4 kind of sit anywhere between 500 grams up to about 1150 grams. So it's somewhere in between the lightest and the heaviest, but I think optically there's going to be few lenses that are going to compete with this. When I talk about 2.8 being an advantage, please don't misunderstand. I'm not talking about 2.8 from a depth of field perspective. I'm not talking about the comparisons of sensor sizes and how it relates to a noise or field of view or anything like that. I'm talking it purely as a light gathering tool from an exposure perspective. And it is a 2.8. So being so wide as well, being an 8mm, you're dealing with, you know, large depth of field, irrespective of being wide open or even closing down your aperture, even at f4, even at 2.8, you know, especially those who are interested in landscape and shooting things at a distance from yourself. Yeah, you have the advantage of still maintaining a very good depth of field on the APS-C sensor, but you have the light gathering of a 2.8 lens. I've seen some other reviews where they talk about who would use this lens, and many have said it's a portrait lens. It could be used for wedding photographers and that. I'm not so sure about that. I'm sure people could use it for weddings, but I'll explain as to why I don't think it may suit that kind of, especially if you're on the go, you're doing portraiture at sort of a fast pace. I'm not so convinced that this lens is well suited for that. I think the 10 to 24 is going to give you that versatility, only be 2 millimeters off from a focal length perspective. But there are other major aspects that come into play as well. Now, I'm not so sure if this lens is entirely incredibly engineered or if it's a combination of lens and sort of in-camera software that's correcting some of these issues. But from an optical distortion, from a lens distortion, yeah, I didn't see anything noticeable. Obviously, this is a rectilinear lens, so this lens is not going to have the obvious sort of distortions that you would find with a fisheye lens. You know, the lines are going to be straight. If you're shooting perpendicular on anything, you're going to have straight vertical lines, you're going to have straight horizontal lines. And obviously the distortions that are well known are like your barrel distortions, your pin cushion distortion, your wave distortions. When I shot lines in front of me, I couldn't see anything obvious. I mean, this is one of the best performing lenses. I've used ultra wide zooms and ultra wides in the past that have had far heavier distortions than this lens, so it controls it exceptionally well. Now, what I'm not talking about is perspective distortion. Those are two totally different things, and this is where I think when I'm talking about the 10-24 in comparison to this, because of the extreme nature of this lens, if you don't use it correctly, you get extreme perspective distortion. Now, this is why I think this lens is it's a specialist lens. This lens could be used in portraiture for these reasons. You could use it to bring about an effect in an image, a perspective distortion, to benefit the image, to make it a better image. You know, those sort of unusual sort of portraits where you get really close to the lens. Even when held perpendicular, you can get a portrait of someone's face and have an incredible amount of background in play, which brings a very unique image. So I definitely think there are pros to using this. But if you're going to do what I do, where, for example, it's an event and there's a dance floor, when I lift up the camera up in the air and I'm not even looking through the viewfinder, I'm just using the screen or just shooting blindly, The 10-24, when I don't get it 100% right, when I'm not shooting perpendicular on my subjects, is far more forgiving from a perspective distortion than this lens. So that's why I say, if you've got time on a wedding day, if you've got time as a portrait shooter, where you can, if you can use it for a shot where you're doing a couple shoot, for example, and you want to put them in a certain part of the frame and get a lot of background, yes, this is a great lens for that. But I'm talking about the whole day, the whole event, the whole wedding. Some aspects of the day, you're not going to have time to sort of correct for these things. You're going to suddenly shoot up or you're going to shoot down, and you're going to get these extreme perspective distortions. All can be corrected in post, but once you correct them, you're cropping in on the image. So effectively what's happening is that you land up maybe originally shooting at 8 mils, and the completed image is actually only a 12 mil or a 14 mil image, where you could have just used a 14 mil and had less perspective distortion in the first place. So I think it's very important for you to evaluate what type of shooting you would use this. So when I was shooting out there, I was sort of getting these colorful changing huts that are very, they're well known in Cape Town. It's at Muizenberg Beach and it's in James. You've got to stand perpendicular to everything. And what that's going to bring about, at least in my sort of opinion, is that you may have cropping. So for you, depending on the height or how elevated you are as the photographer, it's very difficult to stand perpendicular on everything, because you may not be standing high enough with the lens to get the perpendicular angle you want of the scene. So what actually happens is that you lower the camera, you shoot perpendicular to avoid the perspective distortion, and then you're having in post to crop the top of the image and the bottom of the image and getting sort of a panoramic look. And that's fine. In other situations, you might have to shoot up on something, and then you're going to have to be more creative, because the bottom of the buildings, the bottom of whatever you're shooting is going to be exaggerated through perspective. You can also learn how to use it in a way that the perspective distortion benefits you, as I said earlier. I see this being used as in those situations where perspective distortion doesn't matter. It's almost expected. I see this being used as those who shoot skateboarding, in low light conditions or indoors. I see this being used for landscape. A lot of people in other reviews said this is not a lens. This is most definitely a landscape lens. I mean, the fact that you can sometimes get closer to the scenery or closer to the mountain or closer to whatever you're photographing with that sort of wide angle gives a totally different perspective to a lot of other shots. I mean, a lot of landscapes you see today are shot with actually, sort of mid-range to telephoto lenses and not so wide lenses, so you can get closer in, you can, bring the foreground in, you can create all these sort of effects. But the opposite is true. When you go extremely wide, it now opens up a whole nother creative side of shooting landscapes with a really wide lens, and it gives a different perspective, of whatever you're shooting. So I certainly see this as a landscape lens. Sports for sure. And I think also what's important to note is those of you who want to carry less lenses, yes, there will be heavier lenses because they're zoom lenses, but are keen on using zooms and having a constant 2.8 from your widest all the way through to your longest lens, you now have the opportunity. There might be obviously a reason why they've chosen these focal lengths, but if you look at it, Fuji now has an 8 to 16 2.8, a 16 to 55 2.8, and a 50 to 140 2.8. So you effectively have from 12 millimeter on a 35 millimeter sensor in equivalence, field of view equivalence, you have a 12 mil lens all the way up to about a 210 millimeter lens. From an exposure point of view, equivalence of 2.8. Obviously depth of field is different. Would be probably shooting similar to an f4. Yeah, so at least Fuji has thought about this. They've covered the basis. So if you are a landscape shooter and you're using zoom lenses, which a lot of landscape shooters do use, you now have 3 solid, well-built, incredibly designed WR, which is the weather-resistant, optically amazing lenses to go and do landscapes with your X-series bodies. So I think this is a great move from Fuji. Cost perspective, this sits around a $2,000 mark. I think it's in the 30,000 rands, just over 30,000 rand in South Africa. I haven't actually checked out the South African price yet, but looking at the dollar rate, you're looking at about 30,000 rand or just over. And yeah, that's a lot of money for a lens. But if you go look at any other lens in this segment, you think about the engineering that's involved in creating an 8 mil to 16 mil or even a 12 mil to 24 and a 35 million equivalence, making it a 2.8 lens. I mean, just go look at go look at the lenses in the same segment in the market. Go check what they are charging. This is a specialist lens. This is a very particular lens. This is not just for anyone, oh, I'm looking for a wide. Well, if you're looking for just a wide, go buy Fujifilm's 14 2.8 or go buy the 1024. You know, it's not going to have the issues that come from a perspective, distortion perspective. It's going to be easier to shoot with, more forgiving, but it's not going to give you that unique look, which is why someone would buy this lens. The one thing I've learned over the years shooting ultra-wide lenses, whether they be zooms or primes, is they all suffer from the same thing. They suffer from corner sharpness, especially being shot wide open. So if you were to shoot this lens, adjusting it to 10 mils, shooting it at f4, and you shot the same shot with the 10 to 24, the 10 to 24 is going to have less corner sharpness than this lens. So this is not just a faster lens, it's not just a wider focal length, it is a superior lens. It performs better. Now, the 10 to 24 corner sharpness is not an issue for me. It really is unnoticeable when I hand the image over to clients. People are like, oh, look at that left corner, right corner, it's not sharp. It doesn't affect the way I shoot, but there are people going to want, especially if you're shooting sort of structural stuff, architecture, which this lens could work very well. It's important that you have that sharpness going out. So that's something to also remember. Shooting wide open, you have better sharpness throughout the frame. Obviously, once you stop down to f8, it's perfect all the way from center to outside. And even the 10 to 24 sharpens up dramatically when you start stopping it down. Obviously, the one thing about the lens is it's got a built-in lens hood. It doesn't have a filter thread. But there are devices you can buy out there if you're a person who uses filters for landscapes and things like that. There are devices. They're quite pricey, so you've got to factor in the fact that you've bought a lens and now you've got to buy other things as well that are big in price. Those are things to consider. The other part of interest to me with this lens was how it handled sun flares. Now, obviously, in these beach scenes where I've got the surfers walking across me going into surf, I'm shooting at the extreme end. I'm shooting at sort of f22, f16. Which obviously gives you a beautiful sun flare star effect, but it's also going to give you issues. So here, for example, I have protection of the surfboard, which stops a lot of the diffraction. But if I go more into areas where there's direct sunlight, shooting at sort of those sort of apertures, you're going to get a lot of diffraction of light, with the moisture in the air, with the wind blowing the sand and things like that. So obviously I haven't edited this, I've kept it as it is. You would spend a lot of time editing that. So probably in these situations, it's, you could quite happily shoot at f8. You might not get as many arms on that star, but you certainly would get a beautiful star and a lot less editing to go with it. So yeah, this is another one here. This is a little bit more of the sun coming straight in. I think they're lovely. I think it's, this is images stopped down by about 3 stops, to control that direct sun, to create that silhouette and that shine on the water. So it's got nice tonal contrast. And I think overall the lens really performed really well. Here's another example of the light coming through from the side. This image was shot at f16, and, beautiful sun flare there again. And just as an example, I shot one where I opened up the aperture a little bit. And yeah, still got a reasonable sun flare there, and that's at f8. So yeah, it works very well. This is a bit, a little bit different. We have a subject that's a lot closer to me. They've got some nice out of focus areas. This was shot at 5.6, and that's a lovely out of focus area for 5.6, nice and close to the subject, and a reasonable little sun flare coming through on the side of the pole. So I was very impressed. It performed very well. Thanks so much for your time. Thanks for watching this video. If you're interested in color contrast and tonal contrast, I've just released a video explaining the two and the difference between the two. Go check it out. Here's the link. And at the end of the video, I have other links as well to other videos that I've done, other reviews. And yeah, again, I really appreciate your time. I hope this was helpful to you, those who are interested in this lens. Please do hit that subscribe button, and thank you to those who already have. I really do appreciate your support, and I wish you guys all the best. Have an awesome day, and God bless.